of insurance. I know she said that you have to be very careful, the plants that are growing, the number of plants that are there. She went into great detail and she said, for heaven's sakes, check on where the money is going. She said, and do not follow Colorado or what is going in Oregon, because both states are having a lot of trouble. So that's what she had to say. She's very well versed in all of this.
Any insurance regulations would probably be dealt with at the state level. That's something that DBR would address. It's probably not something that the town would have the ability to regulate, given the fact that the state would be regulating the insurance requirements for some of these businesses.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, because I would hope that anyone growing marijuana might have some kind of insurance just in case something would go wrong. I don't know. That's just my personal feeling.
Dwight, do you have any follow-up on that based on your experience?
You know, I had a professor of law school, when he wasn't quite sure the answer, would rub his chin and say, that's a very good question. Actually, it is a very good question. And I'm thinking here of all these years I've done land use things. I don't think that I've ever seen a zoning ordinance that required insurance for any use. I don't think it's enabled by the statute anywhere in the country. So what Peter Regan's saying is that it is almost certain that the licensing process at the state level, they have the authority to impose an insurance on a license. But what we're doing here is zoning. So, you know, if you thought a used auto parts place was dangerous and you wanted to impose insurance on it, you couldn't do it with zoning. At least I've never seen it done. So there must be a reason why we never seen it. And I think the reason is it's zoning. It's not state licensing.
Yeah.
Got it.
Michael?
The testing facilities, do they store any product, or do they cultivate any product for testing, or does it all come in from the growing sites?
My understanding, it all comes in from the cultivators, and so really what you're talking about is a lab that is testing that product. So my assumption is they would have some product on site, and there are security and other regulations in the ordinance that would apply to those facilities as a result.
One other question. Now, is there any signage requirements on these facilities, on the cultivating facilities, on the lab facilities, or the testing facilities? I mean, do we want people to know what's going on there, or is it just a matter of them identifying themselves, with a corporate name or something like that?
I'm taking a look here. I can't remember off the top of my head whether we addressed signage in the ordinance.
I know we discussed it in the meetings as being a concern, but I don't know if it's actually in the ordinance.
What's the general feeling there about, about these facilities? Is it something that we want, kind of to be? Do we want people to know what's going on there, or do we not want people to know what's going on there?
Well, I think
I think
probably don't want to.
If I could
please,
speak to that, at page 13 of the draft that you have, under section G4, identification of the location of a non-residential cooperative cultivation location shall be limited to a directional sign only.
Mm-hmm.
And the committee may remember that, as Peter Regan's saying, we did discuss that and decided that it would be better just to have a directional sign.
Yeah. And I think most of these cultivation facilities or testing labs, they're not trying to advertise, unlike a compassion center or a retail facility. These cultivation and testing facilities really aren't trying to advertise or let people know where they are.
And also under H, enforcement on page 14, none of these uses that are enabled by this amendment are permitted to have an accessory sign on the site. These two uses are really low impact uses, particularly the testing lab, which there's very small amount of product in a testing lab, because the value of the product, the growers aren't sending any substantial volume of product to the lab, just samples as required by state licensing laws. But still, we decided that we'd only have a directional sign in that one use and that no accessory signs would be allowed.
Okay.
Other comments from members of the planning board? Bill?
Yeah, so thank you, Paul. It needs to be said before we open it up to the public. Not only is Middletown fortunate to have the best planning staff in the state, and I mean that sincerely, and Peter and Dwight and John leading this effort. We have not produced a document that's going to address every single possible loophole or issue. We can always find situations that will loopholes around the ordinance. It's the nature of not only zoning, but it's the nature of this particular issue. There's always a way, but I'm proud to be part of what Ron and Rita and Peter and Dwight have done, and the town needs to know that the public has been served well here by not only staff but consultants and planning board members. We spent a lot of time on this ordinance, and it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's pretty damn good, and I'm pretty happy with it. So thank you for the good work to the staff, and I hope the public recognizes that going forward.
Thank you, Bill. Other comments from planning board members? I have a question. Go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say, it seems like it's really when you look at the entirety of Middletown, it's really rather condensed. You've got 2 possible cultivation growing areas and 1 testing area. So I look at it from that perspective, and then I just know as a commercial property owner, oftentimes you'll have anchor tenants and others, significant tenants that will stipulate in their leases that there's certain types of uses that are prohibited, restricted, and they run the range from adult entertainment to cannabis related, right? So I think the public needs to know that there are already, I think, just from a business standpoint, limitations on where facilities like this can go. And I applaud the job that was done by the subcommittee. I think from what I've seen and read and have dealt with this issue in many different states, I think we've done a really good job trying to get ahead of what might be coming from the state. So well done.
Other comments from planning board members? Peter, you have a comment?
Yeah, just to follow up on Joe's comment, which I think is a great one. We are probably fairly fortunate here on the island that we may not be that attractive for, let's say, large scale cultivation, because we don't have large mill buildings or industrial sites that can be rehabbed for that sort of indoor cultivation. And frankly, the cost of real estate on the island here might be prohibitive for that sort of a use compared to what it is on the mainland. So we may be fortunate that just based on market conditions, we may not be an ideal spot for cultivation. However, on the other hand, we might be an ideal spot for compassion centers and or retail based on us being a tourist destination. So that's why the committee spent a good deal of time anticipating that in the event that recreational marijuana is legalized and putting the town in a position to, if the council agrees, to prohibit those uses from locating in town.
Other comments? I have a question. I had somebody, a resident, ask me a question and I didn't know the answer, so I'm going to pass it on to you folks. My understanding is that in these retail shops, you can purchase different quantities, different flavors, different forms of marijuana products. And the question was, where does the packaging and treatment occur? Between the cultivation center where the product is grown and the retail shop where these products are sold, where does it get packaged and flavored and whatever else they do to it?
I don't know if Dwight can respond to that one.
The cultivators are the ones that principally process the product at the cultivation facilities.
So
There's not any system of middle operators that I know of, so that the larger companies produce the product in various forms. But there's not another layer in the industry that
do
takes
the cultivators only to the retail outlets?
The cultivators sell directly to the retail outlets, yes. And some of them are vertically integrated, so
Okay.
it often happens that the retail outlets are controlled by the cultivators.
Okay.
Some states allow that, some don't. I represented an operation from Arizona that wanted to be both a cultivator and a retail operator.
Dwight, would it be the type of thing where a retail outlet would sort of put an order in with the cultivator as to what they want in terms of packaging and flavors and whatever else they do?
It's another one of those. That's a very interesting question. Some of the laws enable the cultivators to copyright the names of their product. I don't know if you know that the tobacco companies more than a decade ago filed copyright certificates for various marijuana products, expecting that they were going to transition into cannabis. So it's largely controlled by the wholesalers, cultivators as to what they call it. In terms of repackaging at the retail level, I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Ron, let's open it up to the public. And I want to remind people it's a workshop, so you can exchange comments with members of the planning board and vice versa.
So anyone wishing to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand. If you're on the phone, you hit *9 on your phone to raise your hand. And then when I open your mic to speak, just identify yourself with your name and address. So the first one I have on my list is Carol. Go ahead, Carol, if you're on.
We don't hear you, Carol. You must be muted. Can you hear us, Carol? We cannot hear you. Ron, can you tell if she's muted?
Doesn't look, she's not muted from my end. It doesn't look like she's muted.
Are you there, Carol? Let's come back to her. Who's next, Ron?
Okay, so the next one is a phone number. So go ahead and identify yourself.
Okay, there we go.
Yep. So go ahead with
Address, please. Name and address. Oh, you're muted.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, it's Carol.
Oh, it's
Sorry
Carol.
about
Okay.
I was gonna, it's probably Carol.
Name
Sorry
and address,
about
please.
Okay. Carol Formica, Middletown, Rhode Island, 21 Mass Court. First, I just want to say thank you for being here tonight and allowing the public comments. I do appreciate the efforts that you all have put forth in creating this or drafting this ordinance. I understand that from a local point of view as a member of the Middletown Prevention Coalition and the subcommittee for marijuana policy, as well as a former member of the study commission at the state level. So I do appreciate that effort, and I say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for all your work. I think you probably surmised from my my email and my highlighted concerns that I am not crazy about permitting any marijuana coming into Middletown. But my main concern in reading the ordinance was in reference to the residential cultivations. And if it's okay with you tonight, I'm not presenting per se, I just have questions. Can I go through my questions from the ordinance, you know, one by one, or is that not permissible?
No, you can, but try to make it quick so it doesn't take too much time.
Okay. My first question would be on page 3. The terminology has me concerned. I understand, like under the different definitions, there is the verbiage of marijuana, medical or otherwise. I'm trying to understand, why are we putting in that word or otherwise? That could lead the door to not only legalizing recreational marijuana, but other drugs like Oregon has. So I'm trying to understand why that has been added in the ordinance.
The purpose of that, and as I said at the outset, this ordinance is the intent of this is twofold. Number one is to be able to regulate through zoning medical marijuana related uses that are allowed under the current Department of Business regulations, and then to in anticipation of the possible legalization of recreational marijuana, to have an ordinance in place that would protect the town from those recreational uses locating here. And so if we simply had a definition of marijuana that was restricted to medical marijuana under the medical program, that would be too narrow and wouldn't apply to recreational marijuana if that in fact is approved by the legislature. So having that doesn't mean it's more likely to happen, because that would have to happen at the state level, but it just gives the town what we would consider to be some broader protection.
Okay. My next question would be on page 5. You have the 100 feet on number 1 and 200 feet for number 2. From what I remember, though, from reading, this was changed from 1,000 feet on number 1, and it was changed from 1,500 feet for number 2. Why are we reducing the footage if we're trying to mitigate the concerns of the secondary impacts of marijuana use?
I can answer that. When we, because the committee spent a good amount of time looking at those numbers and looking at maps that Ron and Rita prepared. When we had those original numbers, basically there was no area in town that was available. So it was essentially a de facto prohibition of those uses. So the idea was to provide buffer zones and not to rely solely upon buffer zones, but to rely upon other portions of the regulation in terms of odor control, in terms of security, in terms of lighting and other things to mitigate impacts of cultivation and testing facilities. But essentially the reason the numbers were changed was when you looked at the numbers on the map that we originally had, the entire town was blacked out. And so there was no possibility of those sorts of facilities finding a spot that would comply with those setbacks.
And I'll just add too that when we were talking about that, I was asked to talk with some folks in other communities where cultivation centers currently exist to see what kind of issues have arisen, and particularly related to odor in terms of setback requirements and whatnot. And what I found and what I heard from the other communities is that there really were no issues, particularly with odor, coming from these cultivation facilities, probably as a direct result of the state regulations and inspections that strictly prohibit the odors from emanating from these facilities. So the concern over trying to protect residential, for example, residential abutters from the odor from the cultivation centers was not as much of a concern, again, because there was really no evidence from the folks that we spoke with that was an issue in other communities.
I'd
Well, my
also, I'd also supplement that by saying that my own research on behalf of the committee revealed that the most recent literature within the last 4 or 5 years was certainly different than when I started studying this over a decade ago. And that is that the secondary impacts are essentially non-evident. And in this case, you have a testing center and cultivation where there's never been any evidence of the secondary impacts of crime or other activities that were associated with some retail uses in high density locations in Los Angeles and in Colorado. But the current literature is that there really aren't any secondary impacts from a testing center and from cultivation because there's no retail use there, no congregating of the public at those locations.
Well, thank you. You hit upon my main concern, which was the fact that it could be close to a school, you know, a public or private park or a playground or a youth center, and that's why I'm asking about the footage.
Right. But these are not retail operations, so you don't have the foot traffic. You don't have the possibility of minors trying to purchase product or people being assaulted for the product. It just doesn't, the literature says it just doesn't happen.
Or
Okay.
traffic problems that we're seeing, let's say, right across the line up from Tiverton in Massachusetts from some of the recreational retail outlets as well.
Okay. Well, that brings me to my main concern in the ordinance. When you do talk about the secondary impacts such as crime and fires and health and environmental hazards, is the residential cooperatives. I don't understand, why are we bringing them into residential areas? To me, that upsets me because that sounds like we're bringing marijuana right into our neighborhood.
Well, right now, if you have a medical marijuana card and are allowed to do personal cultivation, you are allowed to do those in residential areas. And the regulations that were revised and adopted by the Department of Business Regulations last year continue that and allow those cultivations in any residential zone, personal cultivation. And that is the area where frankly, under the regulations, the town has the least amount of ability to regulate. So essentially, we don't have the ability under the state regulations to say that we're not going to allow that personal cultivation in residential areas.
Yes, but my question is residential cultivation, when it's one or more people, it sounds like it's like a mini facility, basically, in a residential area.
Well, it falls under the category of personal cultivation and on a small scale, and under the state regulations, which we need to comply with, it is permitted. When you get to larger scale cooperative cultivation and more commercial cultivation, that is where we have more latitude. But
I did look up the DBR regs, and from what I read for the different terms and definitions, I did not come across that terminology of a residential cooperative. So that's where I guess I'm confused. If this does occur, my next question is where does it fit in with the Community Right to Know Act to know where these residential cooperatives are?
in terms of what? I'm sorry.
In terms of the residential cooperatives, how does that fit in with the Community Right to Know Act?
Well, I'm not sure.
Have you lost me?
No, I don't know the answer to your question right now, so I'm trying to
Okay.
to look at it. Okay. Well, I don't think it's affected by that, we'll certainly take a look at it, but I don't think
Okay.
that from a security standpoint that advertising or somehow making public the locations where personal cultivation of marijuana is taking place is probably a good idea, because that can lead to crime and other security issues.
The state statute at 28.614 that's referred to in our regulations does address the confidentiality. First of all, I just point out that if you go back and look at that is very restrictive. It's not going to be a lot of people growing a lot of marijuana. I think the maximum cultivation for a residential cooperative is 10 ounces of marijuana or its equivalent. This can't become a big operation. And the state statute also goes on to say that the reports provided to the Department of Public Safety about the cultivation locations shall be confidential. But locations may be confirmed for law enforcement purposes. So without getting directly to the answer to your question, which I don't have either, the state regime is that the who's growing and what they're growing is confidential, and the locations can be disclosed, but apparently only for law enforcement purposes.
Yeah.
So I ask you to go back and take a look at the statutes that's referenced in our regulations, because it's controlling.
Yeah, and just taking a quick look here at the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, which really deals with reporting on hazardous and toxic chemicals through EPA and DEM. I do not think that would apply to this particular situation of personal marijuana cultivation.
Peter, can we go back to Carol's her first issue with the term? I think correct me if I'm wrong, Carol, the term residential cooperative, and you said you looked at the DVR regulations. Is that the term, Peter, that off the top of your head, that is used out of those regulations? So we have no leeway.
That's actually used under the state statute, under the Slater Act.
Okay, so it's this. So that's why that term is maybe offensive or concerning, but that's the term we're stuck with legislatively and by statute.
Right.
Thank you. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another person who would like to speak? Lori, can you hear us, Lori?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can now hear you, yes. How are you doing?
Great. I'm well. Good evening, everyone. And I just want to start off. My name is Lori Verderosa, 426 Third Beach Road. I come before you tonight, for those of you who do not know me, as a concerned resident, as a therapist in private practice who deals with young adults, adolescents, adults with marijuana use disorders. And I'm also a certified prevention specialist. So as you can imagine,
You attended all of the subcommittee meetings.
Most of them, most of them.
Yes.
I want to reiterate what John and some of the rest of you have said. I did sit in on some of those meetings, and I watched the time and effort and energy and expertise that many of you put into this. And as a resident, I appreciate the work that you've done on behalf of our town. I agree with what you said, Bill. I think that we've got an excellent planning department, and we've really done our homework here. I have some comments and I have some questions. So you've answered some of them, but I think I just want to go on the record and make a comment to start off. So on page 2, in number 5 towards the top, it talks about the town of Middletown considers the protection of the public health, safety, and general welfare of paramount concern in regulating this use. And then below that, in number 8 on page 2 also, It goes on to talk about marijuana-related businesses, including cultivation facilities, manufacturing facilities, testing facilities. Compassion centers and retail marijuana stores have serious adverse secondary impacts. These secondary impacts, which pose a threat to the public's health, safety, and general welfare, include increased crime, illegal sales of marijuana to and use of marijuana by minors, and others without medical need, the use of marijuana in public areas, and adverse impacts on neighboring businesses and properties, including odor complaints, traffic, and decreased property values. I'm excited to see that, happy to see that in there, both of those things. But then we go on, as we've been discussing, and then we talk about allowing testing and cultivation with special permit. So I guess my comment, I know you've addressed it, is that I see both of those things as incongruent. You know, at one side, we're saying we see that there are secondary adverse effects, while I realize they are less than marijuana retail stores and or dispensaries because of the quantity that would be in these facilities. But I do see that as a little bit inconsistent. So that's my first comment. I too have a question about location. I spent some time these last couple of weeks talking to DBR, looking at the DBR medical marijuana regs, talking to the head of the environmental sciences at the Department of Health, who is responsible for inspecting these types of the testing facilities. I did not know a lot about testing facilities. And what I found out is in talking, first, let me talk about the Marijuana Cultivation Center. I spoke with the senior economic policy analyst up there, who, when I asked her, you know, what were the buffers, I had read it and she reiterated they were 1,000 feet. Ours are 100, as we mentioned, and 200 for testing and cultivation. So my question is, I know you answered some of it already, that if we kept it at 1,000 feet, there would not be any locations in Middletown to have testing and cultivation. I asked her, I said, tell me why DBR uses 1,000 feet as their buffer. And what she said, and I quote, 1,000 feet is a best practice that most states utilize. So I don't know if someone, Dwight, you probably know most about what's going around the country. I know why we did it, but why aren't we still aligning to that 1,000-foot buffer if that is a national best practice?
I'll speak to that because I tried to refresh my own knowledge of separation requirements and buffers.
Yes.
And on behalf of the committee, I did review as many ordinances as I could get my hands on around the country. Couple of observations. As a planner, I happen to be a planner as well as a lawyer. Separating requirements are a bit suspect across the board. The biggest concern was if this were a retail operation, it should be similar to a bar or a package store. But this is not a retail. What's allowed here is not retail. It's a testing laboratory and a cultivation. So that's number one. The separation requirements have to do with retail and dispensing and activities, including adult entertainment, among other things, that can have secondary impacts, but the secondary impacts are not here. The second reason, besides the practical notion that it would foreclose anywhere in town from having what is essentially a pharmaceutical testing operation, it just happens to be using cannabis and not something else to test. But besides that practical implication is that the separation requirements really don't stop problems for the most part. it doesn't take any time to walk or bike or drive 1,000 feet. It really doesn't make a difference. And if you're trying to protect children, the separation requirements in schools and playgrounds and that sort of thing have not always been effective as a way of actually protecting people. So I think it's fair to say in summary that number one, these uses don't warrant any substantial separation requirements. The principal one, as Peter Regan mentioned, is and Ron from his research is odor. But we pretty much found that because of the control systems, including the state-of-the-art control systems that are called for in this proposed regulation, that odor has proved to be a non-issue currently. It was an issue several years ago when people were more careless about their operations. But in terms of assaults and thefts and that sort of thing, we just don't see it here. So that separation requirement is not going to make a difference. And then the second thing I said was planners are not really enamored with separation requirements. They haven't proven to be that effective in stopping secondary impacts.
And if I might just follow up just real briefly on that, under the current DBR regs, that 1,000-foot buffer applies only to compassion centers. It does not apply to cultivation.
I understood her in my note, and I will clarify. Thank you, Peter. She said school on that for cultivators. So, but I will, yeah, I will follow up. To which DOH, the gentleman at DOH at testing also said that their buffer is 1,000 feet as well. And they mirror the DBR buffer zone for testing.
Well, what I would say, if the state, if DBR or DOH has a buffer that exceeds what we have here, then that larger buffer from the licensing entity, which would be the state, would apply.
So what does that mean, Peter? Ours needs to bounce up to 1,000?
No, I'm taking another look through here as we're chatting, Lori, but I don't see 1,000-foot buffer with regard to cultivation facilities. In the regulations. There is a 1,000-foot buffer with regard to compassion centers from schools.
She's doing a little bit of research. I asked her some questions that necessitated them to dig a little bit. So I will ask her again on that as well. And then what was my other? My other one relates to odor on testing. And when I spoke to the gentleman up there, there are regulations, I think it's the exhaust, page 7, F odor, number 1. Exhaust vents on rooftops shall direct exhaust away from residential uses or zones. And my question there is, we live on this very windy island. Is that really realistic that the exhaust on the top of a cultivation center or a testing provider would be able to do that, to direct that exhaust away from those residential areas? Because that tradesman center on Oliphant, there's a residential area right next to that. There's a house, as a matter of fact, friends of mine live in that first house right next to the tradesman center. So I question how that would be done, although that's cultivation over there versus testing, as I think twice about it. So those are my questions. Those are my comments. I think, oh, my last comment, I'm sorry, as I look at my notes. So I did ask the policy analyst at DBR. I'm concerned as I read what's going on in Colorado, as I read the HIDTA reports from Washington as well, the high intensity drug trafficking area reports. There are so many unintended consequences. So I asked her, what unintended consequences have we seen with our cultivators? And there are 70 licenses. What we've not talked about is there's 70 cultivator licenses in our state and 1 cooperative. They are not accepting any more applications. They are grandfathered in, and there's a freeze on those. Peter and we talked a little bit about that, them moving in that direction. But I did ask her about crime, and Dwight, I had asked you about crime back some time ago. She said there have been instances of breaking and entering in some of the cultivators, licensed cultivators, and she was pulling up some of that data for me. So that's a bit of a concern for me. I think
Well, the police reports that I've looked at for the last couple of years, and I'd be happy to share some of those with you offline if you want to email me. I'll send you some of the reports that I pulled. But the incidence of crime is very low.
right.
And in this case, if you look carefully at the regulation that we've written, it really is quite strict when it comes to video surveillance systems, lighting, perimeter control on people entering the building so that we know who they are.
Yeah.
So the regulations themselves have a high deterrent effect. So if somebody's looking to make a quick buck, they're going to think twice about going into a cultivation center.
Yeah.
They'll look for a softer target. These are hard targets the way your regulations require.
No, agreed. I understand that the security and all of those requirements are state of the art, and that I appreciate that. I think that's it for me, Ron, in terms of my questions, and whatever you find, Peter, I'd be interested to hear, not necessarily tonight or at a later point.
Well, I just to let you know, I did take another spin through the entire DBR regulation, and the only 1,000-foot buffer is from a compassion center.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laurie.
Sure.
Anyone else, Ron?
There's no one with their hand raised. If anyone else wishes to speak, you can raise your hand. I think that's it.
So are we prepared to put a motion to make a recommendation to the town council? How does the board feel? Are we ready?
I don't see why not.
I'm ready.
Yeah, I don't see why
All
not.
right, may I have a motion to recommend the proposed amendments to the town council for their consideration?
I'll make that.
Motion
I'll
made by
second it.
Art Weber, seconded by BJ. Is there any discussion? Mr. Pyrick,
Aye.
Mr. Chumo,
Aye.
Mrs. Owen,
Aye.
Mr. Weber,
Aye.
Mr. Fenton,
Aye.
Mr. Nash,
Aye.
and I vote aye. The motion passes. And Ron, can you draft a recommendation memo?
I'll do that. Yes.
Is there anything else that anyone wishes to raise at this meeting?
I would just like to also thank our subcommittee and our two attorneys, especially the guy from out of state. I think it's an absolutely remarkable document. I think it captures what a lot of people in Middletown have been worried about. And I think their worries have been well taken care of and addressed.
Yeah, Art.
Again, I will second that as well. John did a great job with the subcommittee. Ron supporting the subcommittee. Peter with his comments and legal advice, and Dwight, your expertise, all very much appreciated.
And I'm the guy that found Dwight, so I'm taking full credit for that.
This has been, I thank you all. It's been a wonderful experience for me. I appreciated the opportunity to work with you all. I really did.
Finally welcome to it.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
for participating
Thank
with us. It was quite an experience. Is there anything else anyone wishes to bring up? I have a motion to adjourn, please.
So moved. Second.
I saw BJ first. Bill, you want a second?
Sure.
Okay, Bill
Second.
seconds. Assume there's no discussion. Mr. Pyrick,
Aye.
Mr. Chumo,
Aye.
Mrs. Owen,
Aye.
Mr. Weber,
Aye.
Mr. Fenton,
Aye.
Mr. Nash,
Aye.
and I vote aye. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you all very much for your
Aye, folks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Good call.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you all.